Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Gentlemen, please welcome Catherine Mckinley.
Good morning. Thank you. I hope you all had a great time at the museum last night. And if you didn't like it, you can complain to me because I wanted to try something new other than the boat. We can go back to the boat next year. So I'm really thrilled to have you all here. I think this is one of the very special venues where people from all walks of computer science actually get together instead of in our more domain-specific conferences. So it's one of my favorite events. And so I was really happy to be asked to help organize it this year. And I hope I gave you content that helped you broaden your perspectives. So today I'm introducing Keith Hampton, who's an associate professor in the Department of Communication, School of Communication and Information at Rutgers University. Unlike most of you who have a PhD in computer science, he has a PhD in sociology from the University of Toronto. He's interested in the social consequences of technology, so how the internet, the cell phone are affecting you and your relationships. And he uses empirical approaches, and those have included ethnographies of urban neighborhoods and public spaces and large-scale national surveys. Please join me in welcoming Keith.
Thank you. Today, I want to talk about this. I want to talk about this healthy-looking fellow and what he's doing on the other side of this fence. We have a perception with new technologies that somehow in the past we often had more leisure time, we worked less, that we had closer relationships, maybe more interaction, less isolation, perhaps better community, and even better morality than we did before the introduction of these technologies. Well, I suspect that this may not be shared by everyone in this room. This is often the image that we get from the popular press. To me, studying social change is like studying grass, particularly when you're talking about social change and new technology use. The problem is sociology and new technologies are very different types of grass, right? So this is new technologies. New technologies are exciting, they are psychedelic, they are occasionally responsible for you doing things you might regret. And I hear that you can now find a lot of this here in Washington State. On the other hand, this is grass when we think about sociology. Sociology is really the study of the ubiquitous. It's the study of the mundane. And this is where we get into a little bit of trouble when we're trying to think about how new technologies are influencing society. New technology is about supplanting the mundane through innovation, whereas sociology is about piercing the mundane to reveal the splendor of the obvious, right? My job is essentially to reveal the obvious as a result of the ubiquity of new technologies. The problem is that thanks to people like you, new technologies are constantly changing, but we can only understand how those technologies are influencing society once they become mundane. Predictions about how new technology will influence society are often mixed with nostalgia because we don't wait to the point where they are mundane till we can study them because we want to know how these new and exciting features are affecting our lives. As a result, we end up with, how can I put it, fertilizer, right? We end up with a lot of misunderstanding that fortunately encourages new growth. So we can think back to other new technological changes. This is a quote from a newspaper article in 1888 that appeared in the New York Times. Excessive use of electricity is corrupting the morals of the young. This from an article in 1899 in the Chicago Daily. Women are refinement and exquisite moral training, addicted to the use of the wheel, detrimental to the advancement of morality, nay, even to stability. And then there are questions that are more open from more recent times, where we wonder about how new social media are affecting our relationships. We expect more from technology, less from one another, and seem increasingly drawn to technologies that provide the illusion of companionship without the demands of relationships. This from an op-ed by Sherry Turkle in the New York Times just a couple years ago. I want to talk about two questions about how we think about new technologies and its implications for society. I can't find a better way of phrasing them than the way Stephen Colbert did in his interview with Sherry Turkle. He said, even if I only get information from you in little sips, doesn't that add up to a big gulp? Aren't I eventually knowing more about you? And if I'm constantly online and you're online and we're seeing what each other are doing and we're communicating in that way, how does that alienate each other? I'm going to argue that new communication technologies, particularly social media, are responsible for two fundamental changes in the structure of our communities, and that these changes are only starting to be revealed as the result of the recent ubiquity of these technologies. So are we more aware? Are we less isolated? I'm suggesting that the first trend that we can start to see now is persistent social contact. Social relationships are probably less transitory today than they are at any time in recent history. In the recent past, social ties were lost during key life course events, and fewer social ties are now lost over the life course. So what I mean by this are some classic examples. It used to be that when we grew up, went off to college, we would leave our neighborhood, and often we'd leave those neighborhood social ties behind. We'd leave our high school friends behind. Do you remember those days when we didn't have contact with our high school friends anymore? Now they're back, right? It's harder to lose those foci of activity that we used to naturally lose in the past. It used to be the same about changing occupations. We would leave a workplace behind, maybe maintain a couple social ties, but that's really not the case anymore. Organically connected social ties, which are these ties of kinship, locality, and occupation, they persist and they are applying social pressure over the life course in ways that they haven't in a very long time. Social ties are also increasingly pervasive. We're aware of the activities, interests, resources, and in particular the life course transitions of social ties as they're broadcast through these new technologies. There's a higher surveillance of social ties than there were in the past. Social ties are increasingly specialized. We have an increased awareness of the diversity in our social networks. Whether or not that diversity is actually increased is unknown, but we're certainly more aware of diversity. And there's a higher rate of bridging communication within those social networks, something that has been well articulated by Microsoft researchers like Dana Boyd and people like Alice Marwick, which I think are here today, as context collapse. These trends contrast with really what is the contemporary view of how technological change has affected relationships over time. The traditional view of sociology and community over time is an image of how mobility has increased the looseness of our bonds, how social ties have increasingly become less enduring, how they are more disposable over time, and we have less of these kind of enduring true relationships that are persistent and tied to place and tied to specific foci of activity. I'm arguing that this is really a bifurcation point. This is a transitional stage in the nature of community. So before we can talk about how the structure of community is changing as a result of these technologies, we do need to know a little bit of what they look like in the past. So before we had computer networks, we had social networks. And when I'm talking about social networks here, I'm not talking about Facebook. I'm talking about those networks of connections that we all have to people around us over our life course. This is what community looked like in kind of a pre-industrial time. We had relatively few social ties. Those social ties were relatively densely knit. We had very few foci of activity. Often things like home and work were combined into one social setting. We had a high level of structural equivalence, which meant that when we lost a social tie in the setting, they were often replaced by someone who was connected to those around us in similar ways. We had relatively low diversity, generalized reciprocity, high levels of surveillance, and there was also collective authority and very repressive sanctions. This is very different than what community tends to look like in our kind of modern, post-industrial, urbanized setting. Today, urban industrial community, or at least up until today, consisted of multiple foci of activity. We had voluntary associations. We had work separated from home. We had kinship separated from neighborhood. These are lower density. There are fewer bridges between these foci of activity. While they were present, they were relatively rare. There's relatively low level of surveillance and a higher level of diversity. Foci appear and they disappear over the life course. We have different social settings that we kind of match us at different stages in our life course, and then the relationships in those ties, for the most part, they disappear. And there's a low level of structural equivalence. When we lose a social tie in some of these settings, they're replaced, but they're generally not replaced by someone who is connected in similar ways to those around us. Persistent and pervasive community combines the conditions of pre- and post-industrial community in a new way. Foci are more stable over the life course. We no longer lose those social settings that we would transition through in the life course. There's more bridging between these foci of activity. Density is higher as a result, surveillance is higher, and the perception of diversity around us is also higher. Whether or not that diversity has increased is relatively unknown. We may also have things like higher levels of generalized reciprocity and even a revival of kind of repressive sanctions. So how do we start to understand how the implications of this shift are affecting everyday relationships? Well, I would argue that we need to be doing less of this, which is where we study very specific foci of activity, say relationships on Facebook and Facebook only, relationships within an organization and an organization only, and ignoring all the other foci of activity that exist around us and how they overlap and the connections between them. I would argue that only by studying our social networks and our communities as a whole and the interconnections amongst them can we begin to understand the consequences of persistent and pervasive contact. Now, indeed, the very notion that we somehow were able to look at just one foci of activity and generalize to that about our community at large was always a bit of a false dichotomy. We've always known that relationships that start in person often move online, and those relationships that start online often move to other foci of activity. And by ignoring those connections, I feel like we miss a large portion of our social connectivity and a large part of the story about how persistent, pervasive contact is affecting our relationships. So what is community like when social ties become persistent and pervasive? Your social ties are less transient. It's harder to leave your relationships behind. Foci persist online, and the density of relationships creates this perpetual awareness, if not direct awareness, through first, second, and 3 degrees of separation. You're more aware of the attributes of your family, your friends, and your acquaintances. While the overall diversity of our networks is likely not increasing, we're actually much more aware of the things that are happening around us inside our social networks. And you assume all the benefits of awareness. Awareness is important as a preconditioner to things like empathy and trust. And you're also more aware of the resources that are embedded in your social network, something that we often call social capital. You'll also experience all the costs of awareness. Your ties are aware of your resources too, and they're happy to take them from you. Their awareness is experienced by you as social pressures, and there's a cost of caring associated with your awareness of the things that are happening in the lives of those around you. So first, I want to talk about some of the benefits of awareness. These benefits are from a series of studies that I did with the Pew Internet and American Life Project, data we collected first in 2009, and then we went back and recollected in 2011. These are from large national random samples of American adults. Each sample is over 2,000 people, which gives us more than enough statistical power to generalize to the American population of adults as a whole. I'm going to talk about the benefits of awareness in terms of social capital. Social capital is the sum of those resources that are embedded in your social structure. We can divide social capital into kind of 2 subsets. One is bonding social capital, which is the resources that you get from kind of your closest social relationships. This includes things like warm hugs and companionship, but it also includes a lot of nurturing and other types of things like that. It's really your intimate relationships. It's associated with things like network closure, it's associated with trust, and it's associated with things like shared norms. And then there's bridging social capital. Bridging social capital is the resources that are embedded in your more heterogeneous social ties. It really is your less intimate or weak social ties. It's associated with things like the diversity of your network and your ability to bridge to new types of social resources. So we know from these studies that there is a relationship between the use of these new technologies and your bonding social capital. So we did a study of core networks, which is really those people who are closest to you. We asked people to name those who are closest to them, and then we looked at variation in their use of different types of technologies. We found that, for example, people who are using the internet compared to those who are not, just a simple dichotomy, have on average about 14% more close relationships. And then those people who are using social media, and in this case particularly Facebook, also tend to have more close relationships. This isn't just close relationships online, this is more close relationships in everyday life. We also looked at the bridgingness of people's social ties. We studied the diversity of their network in terms of the different types of social positions they could access. So are you able to access a judge and a professor, as well as, say, someone who works in a secretarial position or middle management? Just how diverse is the range of your social ties? Again, we found that internet users on average tend to have more diverse social networks, and that those people using social media, particularly Facebook, again, also tend to have even more diverse social networks on top of that. However, the important part that we sometimes miss when we're discussing this is that most bridging social capital doesn't come from online interactions. It comes from our participation in very traditional social settings that we've long known are a tribute to the diversity of our network. Really, network diversity comes from participating in diverse social milieus. So people who participate in voluntary groups, religious institutions, neighborhoods, public spaces, even semi-public spaces, the more different social settings of those sort that you're participating in, the more likely your network has become diverse. If we look at the role that social media plays in the use of these traditional social settings, we found that about half of the bridging social capital, about half of the diversity of people's networks, actually comes through both the use of technology and the use of technology in relationship to these existing social spaces. So for example, internet use is associated with more frequent visits to semi-public spaces. This is places like cafes and restaurants. Bloggers attend church more often. They volunteer in more organizations and are more frequent visitors to public spaces. People who share digital photos online, they volunteer even more and visit public spaces even more often. As one example of this, if we look at the most extreme example of a social media user, someone who belongs to multiple platforms and uses them fairly regularly, that intensive social media user has a network that is about 46% more diverse than someone who doesn't use those technologies. And about half of that, or 21% of that 46%, is attributed to greater use of these established social settings that have long been associated with more diverse social contexts. So, to move on to something different here. So the technology that provides the persistent and pervasive contact is, for the most part, I think, a social good. But it's really not about the technology itself. It's about the underlying social structure that is afforded by this technology. So these network structures may also have less desirable consequences. And in some ways, I feel like I have to apologize to my hosts here for a second, because my invitation to come here was prefaced with a very nice sentence that says, "We noticed that you've recently discovered all these really nice positive relationships between new technology and society and relationships. We think that that's exactly the type of thing that our audience here is going to want to hear." And I knew instantly when I read that I had just collected some data that suggested there may be some social outcomes that are not as positive, and that I would have to talk about them. These are findings that we haven't published yet. They will be published later this summer as part of 2 reports with Pew Internet and Everyday Life. So, with appropriate theming. I feel like they should have darkened the lights too, but that's all right. Okay. The costs of awareness. I want to give 2 examples of how the awareness afforded by persistent and pervasive contact can be problematic, or is potentially problematic. The first one deals with participation in a deliberative democracy, and something that in communication we talk about as the spiral of silence. And the second is social stress, and specifically the costs associated with caring. So first, let's get a little bit of terminology out of the way. What do I mean by deliberative democracy? Well, deliberative democracy is the idea that somehow the legitimacy of our democratic process here in America and elsewhere is about more than just voting. It's about a process whereby citizens go out and they voluntarily discuss important political issues with other citizens, as well as with our elected officials and so on. And this ability to have political conversations is important things like tolerance, political knowledge, and political participation. That is, the more we deliberate, the more informed we are, the more we understand opposite points of view, and the better we are to have a common discussion about these issues. There is some debate in communication and elsewhere about just how deliberative these conversations have to be. Some people think it has to be a forum like this, where we take turns up here talking to each other, and it's very formalistic, and that's true deliberation. Others, and this is where I kind of favor this argument, is that political conversation can be much more everyday. It can be things that take place in our home. It can be the conversations we have over breakfast and in the hallway. That these conversations about education and about politics are just as informative to us in shaping our opinions. However, this process fundamentally depends on people's willingness and their exposure to information on public issues and their willingness to discuss these issues with those around them. There is some existing evidence out there that new technologies, in particular social media use, are associated with higher levels of political participation. Participation is somewhat different than deliberation. So again, from some of the research I've done with the Pew Internet and Everyday Life project, during the national elections in 2011, we went out and surveyed people over the election period, and we found that those people who were using Facebook a couple of times per week compared to those, someone who uses Facebook a couple of times per week compared to someone who uses the platform multiple times a day, the more frequently they use Facebook, the more politically active they were. They were more than twice as likely to have attended a political rally or a meeting. They were 50% more likely to try to have convinced someone else to vote for a particular candidate, and they were about 40% more likely to have said they voted or intended to vote. There's also evidence from other studies to suggest that social media has aided in things like collective action in the Middle East and elsewhere. Again, democratic participation does not equal deliberation. And in fact, there's some evidence out there to suggest that the more cross-cutting deliberation we have, particularly amongst our closest social ties, the less likely we are to participate. That is, the less likely we are to do things like vote. So there is somewhat of a tension between deliberation and participation. But more than that, there's very little empirical evidence out there that for most people, social media have increased exposure to information on political issues, opened up new opportunities for everyday political conversations, or reduced barriers to sharing opinions with those around us. So that's why we set out to study political conversations. So from August to September of last year, we did a random digit dial survey of American adults. Again, we did a sample of people on their traditional phone lines. We used their mobile phone lines. We did the survey in English. We did it in Spanish. About 1,800 adults, and it was collected by the Pew Internet and American Life project. We wanted to know where people got news about important public issues. We wanted to know how willing people are to discuss political issues in different social settings. We wanted to know how likely they were to discuss politics at home, how likely they were to discuss it with friends at a restaurant, in public meetings and in the workplace, as well as how likely they were to discuss political issues through social media on Facebook and Twitter, our two kind of most ubiquitous social medias. We wanted to know how social media use is related to information exposure and people's willingness to join conversations in these different social settings. In doing so, we focused on one very specific political issue. That political issue was the recent revelations in last summer of Edward Snowden and the US government's use of surveillance to monitor people's telephone calls, email, and other online communications. Now, we could have chosen any popular political issue to be able to use to follow in the survey to be able to see how people were willing to discuss such an important topic. But this one, it was new, it was hot, it had just happened. At the time, Edward Snowden said, the US government has been collecting metadata. And it was limited to metadata last summer, and that type of collection, which we all learned something about what we think metadata is, and things have changed since then. I mean, we now know that the information that the US government was collecting is probably much more extensive than metadata. And I'm not sure we would have picked the same topic to follow if we had done this survey this summer as opposed to last summer, because I think you could argue now that there may even be a kind of repression in democratic deliberation online around this issue just out of fear of being monitored. We don't have any evidence that that's true, but it certainly was not true last summer when we did this survey. So we focused on Edward Snowden's revelations. Okay, and at the risk of giving you a little bit too much information here, this report will be released probably later this month with Lee Rainey and my graduate students, Weish Liu and In-Young Shin. The dependent variable here that we're most interested in is people's willingness to join a conversation about these issues in different social settings. We looked at a range of different independent variables as controls. We looked at your kind of standard demographic control variables like age and education, but we also looked at different types of social media use and different types of traditional media use. So we looked at where people were getting their news, whether it was through TV, whether it was through radio, newspapers, online sources. We looked at variation in their use of a wide range of social media, and we also looked at variation in how they use those social media. So how often they sent personal messages through Facebook versus how often they were commenting on people's posts in the social media stream. Initial findings. Okay, this is a bar graph of people's willingness to voice their opinion in different social settings. The first 4 bars are in-person interactions. So this is your willingness to have a conversation over a family dinner, a restaurant with friends, in a community meeting, and in a workplace. As you can see, about 86% of people were willing to have an in-person conversation with people around this issue. This last 2 bars are people's willingness to have a conversation around the same issue through 2 different social media platforms. People were about half as willing, or about half as many people were willing to have a conversation online about this issue as they were likely to have it in person. That leaves, if you do the math here, about 14% of Americans who were not willing to have a conversation in person about this issue, about an important public issue. We would like to think that social media is providing an opportunity for that 14% to engage in political discussion. Here's what we found. This needle in this apple, that's the percentage of people who are willing to have a conversation online who weren't already willing to have a conversation offline. 0.3% of American adults who were otherwise unwilling to have a conversation about an important political issue in person were willing to do so online. Now, this was actually kind of surprising, but I'm not sure it should have been, because all of our prior research suggests that new technologies are not replacing social interaction, that they're supplementing social interaction. So maybe I shouldn't have been overly surprised to find that it's not providing new opportunities necessarily as well. Okay, what did turn out to be really important is awareness. Awareness is the most important difference between social media users and others. So here we have 2 graphs about awareness of the opinions of family and close friends. Non-internet users are the first bar. As you can see, about 18% of non-internet users express uncertainty about the opinions of their friends and family's opinions on this issue. Internet users who don't use social media, couple percent less express uncertainty about the opinions of those around them. But what gets really interesting here is when we look at those people using different social media. Facebook users and Twitter users are much more certain about the opinions of those family and friends around them than people who are not using social media and non-internet users in general. And I should say, the difference here between Facebook users and Twitter users is a little bit, it's not being presented ideally. Twitter users, there are very few Twitter users who are not Facebook users. So really that final bar is an additive bar. It's people who are using both Facebook and Twitter. So people who are using more types of social media are more likely to say they're aware of the opinions of their friends and family. Now, awareness we tend to think of as a fairly good thing. But it turns out awareness is not always good, and there's a classic example from the communication literature in the spiral of silence. Those who feel that they hold a minority opinion about a particular issue will be more likely to self-censor in a social setting out of fear of social isolation or ostracism or some sort of ridicule. The tendency to self-censor depends on both the reference group that you're around and the forum for discussion. So for example, a person might be willing to have a conversation with family over dinner if they suspect that their family members agree with them on their opinion of this particular political issue. But that same person might not be willing to have a conversation at work about this issue if they feel that their colleagues don't support their opinion on the same issue. So just to make this clear, your awareness of the opinions of people in your workplace influences your willingness to speak out at work about this public issue. The same issue, your awareness of your family members' opinions about this issue influences your willingness to speak out, say, over a family dinner about this issue. For the most part, and for most people, awareness of your family's opinion doesn't have much influence on your willingness to speak out about that same issue in the workplace. And there are, of course, some people who are willing to speak out about an issue, don't matter what the social situation, right? They are people who, for the most part, have really strong opinions. And we control for that in this particular analysis. Okay, so some of our findings. The old spiral of silence continues to persist, right? So we found that people at work were about 3 times more likely to say they'd join a conversation around this political issue if they felt that their coworkers agreed with their opinion on this political issue. We found the same thing in family over dinner. People are about 1.5 times more likely to be willing to discuss the issue with their this is dinner with friends. They're about 1.5 times more likely to discuss this issue with close friends if they felt that those friends were in agreement. And we found the same thing on social media platforms. Facebook users were about twice as likely to say they'd be willing to talk about this on Facebook if they felt that their Facebook friends were in agreement with their opinion on this issue. Here's where things get a little bit different. We find a new kind of spin on the spiral of silence. As you know, social media, it makes it somewhat difficult to be able to constrain your social ties into different contexts. Sometimes workmates see what friends are doing, sometimes friends see what family are doing, and so on. And this kind of context collapse leads to a kind of spillover effect in social media use and the spiral of silence. Someone who uses Facebook a few times per day to start off with is almost half as likely to be willing to discuss this topic at a public meeting. So Facebook users less willing to speak out in person, in public about this political issue. To top it off, the spiral of silence from social media affects self-censorship across domains. If a Twitter user felt that their Twitter followers did not agree with their opinion, that typical Twitter user was about 1/3 as likely to join a conversation at work. If they felt that their followers on Twitter agreed with them, that encouraged them to speak out at work. Those people who are at work and felt that their Twitter followers didn't agree with them were less likely to speak out regardless of how much agreement they felt in the workplace around that same issue. And it was the same in other domains. So a typical Facebook user who does not feel that his or her Facebook friends agree with their position was half as likely to join a conversation when out to dinner with friends. If they felt that their Facebook friends agree with them, regardless of the opinions of their family, of their friends and family, they were only 0.7 times less likely to speak out. So why does social media use reduce people's willingness to join political conversations? Well, I suspect it's probably associated with increased awareness of other people's opinions on political issues, as well as increased awareness of the diversity of our social network overall. Failing to find opinion agreement with social media friends and seeing diversity in our social network as a whole results in a fear of isolation and self-censorship online and in other social settings. To put that another way, we know that, for example, the birds of a feather tend to flock together, and we see this as somewhat an advantage when you can break from that mold. So when you break from the flock, diversity is often related to opportunity. However, it's also true that people who birds of a feather flock together, they also tend to flock to the same places, right? It's no coincidence that everybody in this room, for the most part, has a PhD, right? We tend to flock to similar places. And when you encounter differences where you expect similarity in place, that can lead to uncertainty. Okay, I want to move on to the second potential negative example, and that is social stress. So again, a little bit of a definitions here. Social stress, that's the stress that comes from people's relationships. Typically, they're a result of stressful life events that you experience in your own life, like having a child, getting married, experiencing a divorce, having someone in your life die. These are social stressors. In addition to social stress, we also have psychological stress. Psychological stress is the state where an individual lacks the ability or the resources to adapt and cope with the demands of their situations. In addition to that, we know that there's something out there called the high cost of caring. And that is the psychological distress that results from events that happen in the lives of people around you. Knowing that people are close to you who are going through unfortunate things in their lives, like losing a job, increases your psychological distress. Okay, a little bit of a disclaimer here. We'll call it a trigger warning for the men in the audience. Everything my wife told me is true. She wanted me to underline that, but I didn't. Men are insensitive jerks, and women do carry the weight of their world on their shoulders, and that is the primary finding of this particular study. And this will be released in a second Pew report later this summer, again with Lee Rainey and my students. When we study social stress, we asked participants if they knew someone other than themselves who had experienced any of a dozen major life events over the past 12 months, and if the person was close to them or if they were just an acquaintance that they weren't too close with. The 12 events we used were taken from a kind of known battery of major life events. And here are those events. It included those that almost everybody knew someone who had experienced, such as starting a new job, all the way down to those life events that are fairly rare in other people's lives, such as them being a victim of a robbery or a physical assault or accused or arrested of a crime. Relatively few people knew someone who had gone through those events, and they were more likely to know someone who was a weak tie that had gone through those events, because we have many more weak ties than someone who was close to us. The game of life is a full 3D action game. We sampled from a universe of really unfortunate events out there. If we had had more time and more surveys, we probably could have picked more than 12 events, and there certainly is a larger thing out there in terms of major life events. We focus on 12. Who is most aware of these major life course events around them? On average, women are more aware of major events in the lives of people around them, specifically close social ties. And they're not just a little bit more aware. Women are way more aware of major life events around them than men are, 20% more aware. Younger people and those with more education are also more aware. Why are these folks more aware? I have no idea, right? I mean, we could think of many possible explanations. Ignoring you, don't caring, I'm not listening, my wife thinks it's all of the above. Okay, social media amplifies awareness. So awareness of close ties, these are examples based on typical levels of social media and other technology use. A woman who visits Pinterest about 6 times per month is aware of almost 30% more major life events around her in her social network. If she shares about 8 photos a week, another 14% additional awareness. An average number of Facebook friends, which in our survey was about 320 Facebook friends, they're aware of about 13% more major life events. It's very different for men. Different technologies and different magnitude of awareness. The typical man who sends about 3 text messages per day is aware of about 12% more major events. They visit LinkedIn about 6 times per month, about 6% more events. Using Pinterest, believe it or not, the one consistent technology, aware only about 3% more awareness of events. To give you some idea of the difference in magnitude of this effect, a woman who visits Pinterest about 9 times per month was aware of about 1 additional event from the 12 we studied. Men had to visit more than daily before they were aware of 1 additional event in the major lives of a major event in the lives of those people who are close to them. So information in little bits does add up to a big gulp. Each drop can have a big impact, and different technologies have different impacts for men and for women. Awareness and psychological stress. So how does social stress affect psychological stress? Well, we use a measure that's very common in the literature to measure psychological stress. It's called Cohen's Perceived Social Stress Scale. And we asked people questions like, in the last 30 days, how often you found you couldn't cope with all the things that you had to do? And we created a scale out of this, and we looked at the relationship between both technology use and awareness and psychological stress. Well, to start with, who has more stress? Well, men have significantly less stress than women, right? Those who have higher education, less stress. Those who are married or living with a partner, significantly less stress. And for women, but not for men, those who are younger and those who are employed in paid work outside of the home experience less stress. What about the relationship between stress and technology use directly? For men, we found no relationships whatsoever between their use of any type of technology, ranging from email through Facebook and stress. There simply was no relationship. That's not what we found for women. For women, we found that they had lower levels of stress the more pictures they shared online through their mobile phones, the more emails they sent and received, and the more frequently they used Twitter in particular. However, the relationship isn't exactly overwhelmingly substantive. So a woman who uses Twitter at a typical level of about a half dozen times per month, sends or receives 25 emails per day, shares a couple of digital photos here and there, she scores about 3% less in her psychological stress overall. Only sending private messages, almost like emails on Facebook, was associated with high levels of stress or higher levels of stress for women. That's an important point I want to come back to in a second. The cost of caring. Awareness of unfortunate events, and only unfortunate events, was associated with higher levels of stress. Other events, such as awareness of positive events, had no effect on women's psychological stress or men's psychological stress. Women were affected by a larger range of unfortunate events than men were. Women and the cost of caring. The average woman who knew someone who was close to them who had experienced the death of a child, partner, or spouse, they had about 14% higher psychological stress in their everyday life. If they were aware that an acquaintance was accused of a crime or arrested, they were about 11% higher in psychological stress. An acquaintance experienced a demotion or pay, this too, higher levels of stress. And if they were aware that someone close to them had been hospitalized or experienced a serious accident or injury, again, slightly higher psychological stress. We get a very different picture when we look at the relationship between awareness and stress and men. Fewer overall stressors and actually lower magnitude. Men and the cost of caring. Someone close to them had been accused of arrested of a crime. They had about 15% higher stress on average. If an acquaintance had experienced a demotion or a pay cut at work, about 12% higher in psychological stress. So given the relatively larger number of events related to women's stress and the higher level of awareness the women have of major events in people's lives, the cost of caring as a result of the awareness provided by social media, but also awareness in general, is really a cost especially felt by women. We did find a couple of interesting anomalies. The joys of missing out. When we controlled for awareness, that is, when we controlled for exposure to these unfortunate events in women's lives and men's lives, the relationship between higher stress and private messaging on Facebook disappeared. So this reveals something about how women are using private messaging on Facebook. It's related directly to how women are exposed to information about unfortunate events in the lives around them. When they see an unfortunate event, they turn to Facebook and private messaging, presumably to provide something back. Recall that when women were aware that someone close to them had experienced the death of a child, spouse, or partner, their stress was about 14% higher on average. While women who are aware that an acquaintance, not a close relationship, but an acquaintance who was not close to them had experienced the death of a child, partner, or spouse, they reported lower levels of psychological stress. So it moved in the opposite direction. Women who were aware of someone who was close to them had experienced one of these tragedies, higher levels of stress. Women who were aware of someone who wasn't close to them experiencing the same type of tragedy, lower levels of stress. And it's not a small magnitude either. It was equivalent to roughly the reduction in stress that you would get from being married or having a spouse or partner. I want to stress that I don't think this is something that we would call in German Schadenfreude. This is the pleasure from other people's misfortune. Rather, this is probably related to awareness that things could be much worse amongst your closest social relationships than they are, and seeing that other people are suffering as a result of things that are not affecting you actually reduces women's stress. Okay, summing up. Life under the conditions of persistent and pervasive relationships. You are going to enjoy the embrace of family, friends, and acquaintances throughout the life course. Dormant ties may never truly become dormant. You'll have more close social ties for companionship and support, bonding social capital. More weak ties and better awareness of diversity for jobs, unique information, and so on, what we call bridging social capital. But you're also going to suffer the embrace of family, friends, and acquaintances throughout the life course. There will be new uncertainties as a result of newfound diversity. There will be an increase in the experience of the cost of caring, especially for women. And there are long-term social trends that are at this point relatively unclear. We don't know under what conditions in-group versus cross-group social pressures will matter. We don't know if people will have higher levels of empathy and trust as a result of this increased awareness. And we don't know if there will be a return of kind of more negative outcomes, such as collective group control and repressive sanctions as a result of the social structures that are likely to result from this shift in community. How do we design for a better tomorrow? Well, we have to remember it's really not about the technology. It's about the underlying social structures that are afforded by that technology. The structures of relationships under persistent and pervasive contact provides both opportunities and constraints. Persistent and pervasive contact, despite what a lot of the kind of mass media suggests, is not about alienation and disengagement. It's quite the opposite. It's about connectivity and increased levels of awareness. Awareness and connectivity are generally considered social goods, but they're not without their costs. How do we manage the costs? I really wish I knew, right? I mean, we could spend some time brainstorming about the relationship between social structure and technology use, and we could think about how some of those networks of relationships might be integrated into algorithms to reduce some of the costs of caring, maybe to encourage higher levels of deliberation. But the problem with that is this. Again, we will not know if the grass has been any greener on the other side of the fence for a relatively long period of time. Because studying social change requires a certain level of mundaneness, and that's going to take a while. In addition to that, things that I have suggested are as kind of normative positives and normative negatives. Negatives like the cost of caring and a loss of democratic deliberation may not be as negative as I've led you to believe. Should we maximize for deliberation? Well, fundamentally, the cross-cutting exposure that brings the benefits of tolerance, understanding, and knowledge of different points of view may be a better social good. If deliberation is lower as a result of higher awareness of diversity, that may be the more important social good than encouraging deliberation by itself. There's also some evidence to suggest that areas where we have higher levels of cross-cutting deliberation, we have lower levels of political participation. Do we want to design for deliberation, or do we want to design for engagement? Should we be reducing the cost of caring? Social media does not directly increase the cost of caring. It's about awareness, right? The technology affords higher levels of awareness, but so does going to a lot of parties, right? These are all affordances for awareness. If we want to redistribute the cost of awareness, say more to men than women, do we know that men are equipped to deal with that types of stress? Will they actually see that information, or will they ignore it? It's also not clear that all types of stress are bad. It may be that women are using social media as a tool to help deal with the costs of caring, and that we would be removing a social good by trying to build an affordance that reduces that cost. So with that, I'm going to end with an idea that we can build a better hybrid together, that somehow bringing new technologies and the study of sociology together will help us build both better technologies and build a better understanding of how these technologies are affecting community in the long term. Thank you very much.
Now we have time for questions. So we have people with microphones, so raise your hand. Over there.
Hi, that was great.
Thank you.
I have a question. I actually have two questions. One's relatively dark. But did you take into account avataring as a part of the discourse as it relates to politics? For instance, I'm not alone in my peer group, but my Facebook version of me is way cooler than I am. And I spend a lot of time managing my persona as it relates to the community that I engage with on Facebook. So did you take that into account and how that might be impacting people's decisions about engaging in these conversations in these relatively mainstream social medias? The second question I have is, Facebook and Twitter are, of course, relatively mainstream. Have you got any anecdotal evidence through your research about how the anonymity of certain social networks, Snapchat, Whisper, or Imgur/Reddit, are having on traditional relationships, pair-bonded relationships, fidelity, and the ease with which a number of people will enter into those kinds of conversations and entertain those, and what the impact of that might be?
Right. So the answer is the same for both questions. It's no. And the reason for that is fairly straightforward. This particular study is a large national random survey, right? And there's only so much information we can hope to collect through that type of intervention. If we wanted to know more about how presentation of self through social media was influencing people's willingness to discuss, we would have to either do a very focused survey on that, or we'd have to do more kind of qualitative, maybe even ethnographic approaches. And unfortunately, in this particular study, those were not things we could accomplish, right? Similarly, when it comes to less frequently used social media, those particular social media are used amongst youth. And this was also a study of adults, right? And we do that because youth are fickle. They move through technologies more rapidly than adults do. They adopt new technologies more quickly, and they also use less pervasive technologies. And really, we can only understand long-term trends about how these technologies are used by studying the mundane ones. Anytime that we try and measure the use of kind of infrequent technologies, we just don't have the statistical power in a survey like this.
In the back, number 2.
Barbara Gross. Thanks, Keith, very much. This was fascinating, and I will go read your papers and recommend them to others. I had a comment and then a question. And the comment is that as you talked about the cost of awareness, I was reminded of the cognitive psychology research that shows forgetting is good for remembering. And I just wanted to pass that on to you in case that analogy could prove useful. The question, so first, I guess the other comment is it seems like you're talking about correlations rather than cause and effect, and I just wanted to lay that out. The question is that in your studies, not the cost of caring ones, which I have to say the results were not surprising, and I want to talk with you about that afterwards, but on men and women and how they are very different. Did you control for occupation, career stage, and other sorts of things that might have been different among the two populations?
Right, right. So those are really, really important things. Yes, absolutely. This is cross-sectional data. Fortunately, for some of the stuff, the time order is a little bit more clear than it usually is with cross-sectional data. But yes, we are not talking causation. We're talking correlation. In terms of forgetting, it's kind of interesting. I mean, we talked to a range of experts in stress before designing the survey. And thinking about forgetting, none of them could ever remember anyone asking about awareness of stressors in other people's lives before. We thought we were doing something totally new and unique. And then lo and behold, 3 weeks ago, I discovered a paper that was written 30 years ago that everybody had forgotten about, that had done the exact same methodology and found exactly the same thing before we had the internet. The cost of awareness was particularly felt by women. As regards to be able to measure variation based on stage and occupational path and even variation in career, I really wish we could do that study. It would be fantastic, right? I mean, I think we could imagine that there would be all sorts of different findings. And for some reason, over the last few weeks, I've noticed a real uptake in discussions of stress and even social stress on NPR. And they've had a lot more detailed studies about how things like women and careers are affecting stress. So I think there's data out there. Unfortunately, it's not really about technology use, and I don't have it. Yeah.
Bill?
So I too have, excuse me, two quick questions. One is, in your comparing, for example, face-to-face over dinner in the home versus online, you talk about communication, but I think, do you differentiate to the question of whether you're having an exchange versus the levels of trust? So I think that what I would call, and have called trustification, is as important thing to measure, and the affordances for trust building on each channel, and not just whether you're conversing. And that would normalize or balance things.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And that was one of the reasons that we did the study the way that we did it, because we were really interested in how willingness to speak out about a political issue might vary by both social setting and tie strength, for example, right? So we knew that, family relationships and close friends, these are, by very nature, close relationships. We expected people would feel more willing to speak out in these social settings than they would, say, at the workplace, which tends to be, some close ties, but more mixed in general. And a public meeting we imagined as kind of, the kind of weakest opportunity for deliberation that we could imagine in kind of a traditional setting. What surprised us, I think, was that the same social forces persist across all of those settings. And we didn't know where social media fell on that continuum. Do people consider Facebook and Twitter to be different types of social media and types of relationships maintained? Would, I think we often think, Facebook is more close relationships and Twitter is more weaker relationships. Would we see that, social pressures are less likely to exist out there in some social media like Twitter and more likely to exist in some social settings like Facebook? What surprised us again was it just didn't matter, that those social pressures persist regardless of the setting and the social pressure and tie strength. But what really surprised us, I think, was that the social media pressures seem to exist in physical social settings. And again, there's some issues here with correlation and causation, but I think it, is at least problematic to think about how our inability to be able to, silo off social media into different types of social relationships might lead to social pressures that persist in settings that didn't exist before.
So, so if you have these interactions, the question is the political discussion so on having any constructive value? Is anybody learning, or is it just churning and chatter? So, for example, it comes back to trust. In the world's most connected, with access to information, through communications technologies, how do you explain, with all of that ability to discuss, that 50% of the United States still believe that Saddam Hussein was responsible for 9/11?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a tough question because it brings up the very notions of whether or not we think deliberation has value in a democracy and how much that deliberation matters to things like participation. It also brings up a flaw in the study, which is, we really don't know how informed these people were at the time we interviewed them. It could be that deliberation was low because knowledge was high, and they no longer felt the need to continue to deliberate because they had already done so or been highly informed. The part of the story I didn't tell was the part about exposure to news about this issue through social media and other settings. And what we found was somewhat surprising in that people who were using social media, like Twitter, for example, we found them to be much higher consumers of news through traditional social media. People who were using Twitter were far more likely to be getting news about political issues through television, radio, and newsprint, which is not the usual story, right? In addition to that, somewhat forgot what I was going to say. In addition to that, we found that people weren't actually gaining knowledge about political issues through their use of social media. It could be, this is the kind of, again, negative side of the story, is that we may only use social media for keeping up with the Kardashians, right? It may turn out that actually doesn't provide a lot of new news in relation to kind of important political issues. And I think that would be an unfortunate part of the story, but it may be true as well.
All right, let's take one more question over there.
Hi. I wanted to make a difference in political discourse between talking at and talking to. And what the gentleman said about his cool persona on social media means that as a person who is talking to somebody, he might feel a little shy, but on the social media, he can be aggressive and he can be talking at. And a lot of political discourse on the social media is talking at rather than talking to.
Right, so I mean, it's interesting. We don't know from this particular study, but we do know that people are much less likely to feel willing to talk out online than they are in person. So if, as you suggest, that people feel like the technology is somehow provides for less kind of true deliberation and is more kind of one way, then that may provide some explanation for why people have less willingness to speak out in those settings. It may also be that there's some kind of experiential learning going on here, and that people see maybe as a result of increased repressive sanctions, how trying to speak out in a social media setting has resulted in their conversation being shut down through one means or another, and people being punitively punished or embarrassed or ostracized as a result of trying to speak out about a political issue. They may learn something from that and then in turn be less willing to speak out in the future.
Let's thank our speaker one more time.
Thank you.
Thank you.